Welcome to the Director's Cut with East Lansing Public Library's Director, Kristen Shelley.
Welcome to the Director's Cut podcast. I am Kristen Shelley, Director of the East Lansing Public Library. The library enriches, connects, and transforms lives through knowledge and innovation. In this new podcast, we will have conversations with various leaders who have made a difference in their communities. Our first guest is Mitch Albom, an award-winning best-selling author, journalist, screenwriter, playwright, radio, and television broadcaster, and musician. His books, including The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, have collectively sold more than 39 million copies worldwide and have been made into Emmy award-winning television movies. He became a nationally acclaimed sports journalist at the Detroit Free Press and one of the best-known media figures in Detroit's history. He currently hosts a daily talk show on WJR Radio. Mitch, welcome to the first ever Director's Cut.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Oh, we're very excited to have you. And of course, we're going to be talking to you about your new book, The Next Person You Meet in Heaven. And I finished it and I had so many emotions, like all different kinds of emotions. But really, to put it personally, I lost my mother a year ago in April. And it just brought back so many thoughts and it kind of reconnected me in a whole different way with my mother. So I appreciate that. I appreciate having read a book that would do that for me.
Well, I'm glad that it did. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. You have mentioned in articles and in interviews that your readers requested another Heaven book. But other than your readership, did you want to keep going? Did you want more closure with Annie or with Eddie's story and with connecting Annie and Eddie?
The first book was based on an uncle of mine whose name was Eddie, and so Eddie for me was always a bit of a half real, half fictional character. And I really enjoyed writing The 5 People You Meet in Heaven because it was my first novel. You never know if you can write fiction until you try it. So that book was always partial to me. And in that book, an old man named Eddie dies thinking he's a nobody. He dies saving a little girl from an accident in an amusement park. He pushes her out of the way from a falling cart, and the cart hits him instead and kills him. And he goes to heaven and he meets 5 people from his life, which is the first stage of heaven in the book. And those 5 people explained to him that how this insignificant life that he thought he led was actually very significant, even though he was a blue-collar worker and a maintenance man, thought he never did anything. He actually did many things just by touching other people. And I thought that was a pretty complete story in and of itself. And then people did ask me over the years, well, what's the second stage of heaven? What happened to Eddie next? And what happened to the little girl named Annie that he saved? But I used to answer, well, just use your imagination, I guess, because I wasn't really a sequel writer. I'd never done a series or anything like that. And it's only in the last few years that after losing people in my own life, as you mentioned, you lost your mother, and I lost my mother, my father, and our little girl that we were raising, one of our orphans from Haiti, all in 3 years. So it was a real kind of stunning 3 years, and it had my mind quite a bit on sort of what happens next and where are they now in the afterlife. So that's as much as the questions from the readers that sort of pushed me into returning to the heavenly concept.
Very good. So yeah, I should mention too that my mother actually died 3 years to the date within the hour of my father dying. So so like I said, these books, bring forth quite a bit of thinking and philosophy and, regardless if you're religious, it's the spirituality of it.
That's right. Yeah, it's not a religious book. Sometimes people hear heaven and whatever, but it's not for one religion over another. You can be irreligious, you can be heavily religious. I think it's more of a fable that kind of talks about how interconnected we are with one another.
Absolutely. I think it's the interconnectedness. So I love the story of your Uncle Eddie because you include that in kind of a preface, and his story of seeing the people in his lives. Was it after a surgery? I think when he was in the hospital,
Right.
And I can't. That would be an inspiration right there for writing a book.
Yeah, he was a grizzled World War II veteran, tough guy, and the only person who I have known in my life who actually had a real near-death experience when he was operated on later in his life in an open heart surgery, and he claimed that they lost him during the operation. We know that, and he claimed that he floated up above the bed and looked down on his body and saw all of his dead relatives waiting for him at the edge of the bed. And of course, being kids, we would say, "Well, what did you do, Uncle Ed? What'd you do?" And he said, "What did I do? I told them, get the hell out of here. I'm not ready for any of you yet." And apparently he scared them right back to heaven. And so he lived for another 10 years or so. But I always thought, well, that must be what really happens when you die, because, he wouldn't lie to me. He had no reason. He wasn't trying to sell a book or a story or be on a talk show. He was just telling me what he experienced. And so I've always believed that that's what happened. I still do.
Yeah. That's great. It's a wonderful story. The title, The Next Person You Meet in Heaven. So the story really follows Annie's meeting her 5 people, yet the title alludes to meeting a single person, or it did for me anyways.
Yeah, because just as the 5 people you meet in heaven, really it's a book about Eddie, but it explains how heaven works for everybody. And you find out that when you go to heaven, the first stage is you meet 5 people. And then, as I told you, everyone was asking me, what's the second stage? What's the second stage? What's the second stage? So the next person you meet in heaven is because one of the 5 people that Annie meets in heaven is Eddie. And Eddie discovers that the second stage of heaven for him, after meeting 5 people, is that he becomes one of 5 people for someone else. And so the next person he meets in heaven is the person he's waiting for, which is Annie, the little girl. And so the answer to everybody's question about the next person you meet in heaven, after the 5 that you meet, the next person you meet is the one that you're in line for, to try to explain how the world works, and therefore the title.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, absolutely. So in both
Once somebody explains it, it makes perfect sense. Once the author comes on your podcast and explains it, then it makes perfect sense. And I'm just going to have to do that with every single reader who has a podcast, and then they'll all understand.
No, it went full circle for me, but I wanted to extrapolate some of that for our listeners. But yes, no, I think listeners will get that. So in both your Heaven books, you have your main characters, Annie and Eddie, not able to speak at the beginning of their afterlife journey. Why did you add for Annie the challenges of initially not having her body, then having to acquire her body parts throughout the journey?
Well, so in Annie's case, what happened to Annie after the accident, well, Eddie died, obviously, when she was 8 years old. He saved her, but he died. She was saved, but she was injured. She lost her hand, and it was reattached, surgically reattached, but that wound and that accident haunted her for the rest of her life. So when Eddie goes to heaven, in the first book, he has his own body, but he feels like a child. And as he journeys through heaven, he goes from feeling like a child and having no pain or whatever to slowly decaying and being reminded of all his earthly pain. In Annie's case, for reasons that I can't really divulge because I don't want to ruin the ending of the book, she kind of goes backwards, and so she starts as a nothing, and starts, and then she has nothing. No, she's just her eyes basically, and then her face appears, and then slowly her hands, and then her feet, and then her arms and her legs and her torso, and you're just going to have to read the book in order to understand exactly why. But because she was young, I wasn't going to do the decaying of her body. She wasn't decayed. She died when she was young. But she had issues about losing her hand and things like that made that an important element of the storytelling. I'm trying to answer your question and still be vague enough not to spoil some surprise ending.
Well, exactly. I was going to say there might be some spoiler alerts in here, because there is a bit of a
short book to have a spoiler alert, because you can finish it in an hour and a half. So I want to keep people on a little bit of suspense.
Well, right, and there is a twist for the reader in the next person you meet in heaven. So, and
yes, there is.
I appreciate that a person can read the 5 people you meet in heaven and the next person you meet in heaven independently of each other. Was this your intent? I mean, did you feel that you intertwined the stories and divulged enough of the first book in the second book so that new readers could start the journey with the next person you meet in heaven?
I think, having never written a sequel before, I think I was going to err on the side of caution no matter what. And because there were 15 years in between, I couldn't just assume that people had all read The Five People You Meet in Heaven. I mean, there may be people who are now reading my books who didn't even know I wrote a book called The Five People You Meet in Heaven. 15 years is a long time. You can catch on to an author and not be aware of their previous works. So I wanted to make sure that they could be independent of one another. But also, I think any good book, any good sequel should be independent of the other thing. Otherwise, it's only good if you read the first one. And so, I was trying to be very careful with that. And you're right, you can read The Next Person You Meet in Heaven and with no background. But I do believe if you do read The Five People You Meet in Heaven, or you have read it, it's enhanced for you. The familiarity of Eddie coming back and reappearing again, hearing his voice, some little, sort of things you would only get if you read the first book, but you don't need to get if you want to read the second book, are in there as well. And I've heard from readers who were really devout readers of the first book who really appreciated little references to the first one and the second one that only they would get. I think that's a tightrope you walk when you write a sequel.
Right. No, I agree. And I appreciated the fact, because I read them backwards. And, and I actually, that's not true. I read The Five People You Will Meet in Heaven, or That You Meet in Heaven, when it first came out. And then, the story slowly came back to me when I read The Next Person You Meet in Heaven. And then I went back and reread The Five People You Will Meet in Heaven. But the stories make sense. I mean, they make sense independently. And they are definitely able to be read independently. So how would you say that your writing process differed between the two books, or between even your series of books?
I guess the greatest way I would say, since 15 years passed, is that when I was writing the first book, I was imagining heaven and imagining what Eddie would be seeking once he got there as an older man, looking for validation of his life. And in writing this one, 15 years later, 15 years older, and 15 years into having lost not only my uncle, but all of my older relatives now, including a mother and a father and all that, I was writing it much more from a personal sense, much more from the lessons that were being taught weren't imaginations as much as observations. And some of the things that happen to Annie and that she goes through are things that I have gone through in my own life, and the losses that she felt, and the way that the book deals with loss, even as Annie's in heaven is sort of questioning why did she have to lose all of the loved ones in her life. It's really sort of me talking through her, which wasn't the case when I was 15 years younger, and many people in my life are still alive. So I'd say the biggest difference was the angle from which I wrote the book, an experienced sufferer of loss versus a curious observer of it.
Mm-hmm. You had so much success with Tuesdays with Morrie. I loved the book. I cried. I laughed. But I know the inspiration for this, for your Heaven books, came really from your uncle's story. But after writing and when you were with Morrie, did any of the inspiration come back for writing the Heaven books? Like, did you reflect on the life of Morrie? And did any of that inspire you in writing The Five People You Meet in Heaven?
No question. No question. To be honest, I think there's a piece of Tuesdays with Morrie in every book I've written since Tuesdays with Morrie, because we really did this sort of last class potpourri experience of what matters in life when you're really looking death in the face. And since all the books that have followed have in some way had life and death as a background theme, some more acutely than others, ones that are about heaven, and some more kind of in a background, like The Magic Strings of Frankie Presto or the Timekeeper. But all of them have some kind of tie to my time with Morrie. in the case of The Next Person You Meet in Heaven, the new book, I remember sitting with Maury and hearing him talking about forgiving people. And in the book, Annie is very angry with herself. She feels that she's a person who makes mistakes all the time, and she can't ever get away from that, and everything she touches goes bad ever since that day at the amusement park. And she's kind of haunted by her mistakes. And I based that a little bit on a conversation with Maury, who told me about forgiveness and said to me, you need to forgive everybody everything. It's kind of a very well-known part of Tuesdays with Maury, and many people quote it back to me over the years. Forgive everyone everything, because you're not going to want to die having a grudge or a disagreement with somebody. But what most people don't quote back to me is what he said after that, which was, after you're done forgiving everybody everything, then forgive yourself. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, for all the times you beat yourself up, I wasn't good enough, I should have done this, I should have done that. He said, because when you get to the end, you're going to wish you had been nicer to yourself. And that theme about not beating yourself up for all the things you did wrong is very much at the core of The Next Person You Meet in Heaven, because Annie is one of those people who never forgives herself and beats herself up. Absolutely.
And actually, I'm glad you brought up the word mistake, because I found that a very interesting choice of word that Annie, because when I was reading, I was like, that's not a mistake. That's not a mistake. I wanted to say so many times to her, but then in the end, I appreciated that is how she viewed it. That was definitely
right.
How she viewed it. So,
that's right. I think all the mistakes the things that we characterize as mistakes, much of the time are really just, opportunities to learn something, or a shift in the road, or a chance for you to get better and do something right from something you might have done wrong. And I know, because I'm a walking example of that. Even you're talking to me about Tuesdays with Maury, a book that I get, patted on the back many, many times for writing. But I try to say to people, don't you understand that book was born out of a terrible mistake? If I had gone and seen my old professor regularly, instead of not having seen him for 16 years until I discovered he was dying, I might not have had the same guilt that motivated me to, race out there to see him, and maybe even motivated me to continue to go every Tuesday, and then ultimately led to that book. So that book was, kind of birthed out of a really bad mistake. I was very rude and didn't act kindly towards someone who really meant a lot to me, and yet was given a chance to turn that into something that is, arguably maybe one of the best things that ever happened to me. So I know how mistakes can be bounced back from into other things, and that's what I was trying to illustrate with Annie.
Yeah, absolutely. And forgiveness is so difficult, especially of ourselves. And I hear it when you're talking. It is, it is just truly hard, but it makes a world of difference if we can forgive. So
most certainly. It's a very important lesson.
We just have a couple more questions. And one of them I want to ask you is, has your work in Haiti and in the areas of Detroit influenced your writing and your Heaven books, or perhaps offered you a different insight?
Oh, yeah. No question. This book in particular, which is the first one that I wrote since the death of our little girl, Chica, was heavily influenced by the experience of dealing with orphans and raising orphans and basically adopting an orphan and having a child in your life even later in your life. So that feeling of being a parent and being responsible for children permeates The Next Person You Meet in Heaven, and is a direct result of my time in Haiti. I go to Haiti every month. I'm there 3 or 4 days a month. I operate an orphanage of 47 kids, and I've been going, come January, it'll be 9 years. So that's a big, big part of my life. And I think everything that I've learned about, there's another chapter in this book. I won't say which character, but one of the characters that Annie meets in heaven is talking to her about loneliness. Every person in heaven teaches you one thing. They're there to teach you sort of one thing. And this character is there to teach her about loneliness, something that Annie felt a lot of in her life. And when she says to her eventually, loneliness doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. It's a shadow that comes over your real thing, but it itself has no substance. It's not a disease. It's not a rash. It's not something you catch. It's just the way the light hits your life. And it's easy to get rid of once you realize something really important. And Annie says, well, what's the thing you have to realize to get rid of loneliness? And the character says that the end of loneliness is when you discover how much need there is in the world and how you can fill that need for somebody else. And that's a direct result of my time in Haiti, because anytime I'm feeling down or blue or self-centered or alone with my problems, all I have to do is go down there. And, the need, these are kids who might not be alive otherwise if we didn't take them in, who were abandoned, who were left to die by people who didn't want them, who lost parents in earthquakes or floods or hurricanes, and, were wandering the country for 2 or 3 years as orphans, and their need supersedes your self-pity. And so any kind of indulgence or thought about, how bad I feel disappears when I'm there, and that's certainly in the book. So, yeah, it's a long answer to your question, but yes, everything I write about now is somehow influenced by my charity work, and particularly the work in Haiti.
Well, so beautifully put. And thank you so much for continuing to shine a light on the need, and especially in Haiti and in other areas. I think some of the media has left that area, and we don't get the stories all the time, but there's so much need that we're seeing today. And I hope that when you're speaking and you're out doing your book talks, that you really shine on that message of need and helping.
Yeah. Well, my next book, actually, which I'm writing now, is about Chica and Haiti and that whole experience, nonfiction book, which is actually, I'm planning on having out next year, which is really fast for me, but I very much want to tell her story and the influence she's had on people, even as a child who lost her mother in childbirth, and wouldn't have had the life that she did if she didn't go to an orphanage, and she died of a brain tumor when she was 7 years old, and yet had this enormous effect on the world. So, believe me, I'm not going to forget that lesson. That's front of my mind.
Good. Well, keep sharing it, certainly with those who may forget that lesson. But that you answered my last question. I was going to ask what's next for you, but a nonfiction book centered around Haiti sounds wonderful. So brutally wonderful, but definitely a message we need.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Wonderful is a good word for it. It doesn't, just because something comes with a backdrop of poverty or disaster, sometimes that just is a great contrast for the joy, the absolute joy that we were able to experience with this little girl, even through hospitals and radiation treatments and surgeries and things like that. It was a gift, an absolute gift, and that's the point I hope to make with the book about. It's called The Summer of Chica, and it's called The Summer of Chica, even though she died, because every day with her felt like summer, like we were just playing, and children, I think, in their purest form. And it's pretty pure forms when they come to you as orphans, are exactly that, and they're a gift. So, yeah, I hope it to be an uplifting book. It is so far as I'm writing it, and it's very good therapy for me. So I'm enjoying writing it, and look forward to having that out next year. But right now, I got to deal with this one. I'm coming to East Lansing, I believe.
You are, December 11th.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll be at the Wharton Center.
11th.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll get a chance to tell a much longer version of this story to anybody who comes out, and I think they get a book with the ticket.
They do.
And I'll be signing copies for anybody for the holidays and things like that.
And I already bought my ticket, so I hope maybe we can meet up. So, in person.
I look forward.
You can hear more from Mitch Albom during the author talk and book signing at the Wharton Center on December 11th at 7 p.m. Tickets are $35 and include a free copy of his newest book, The Next Person You Meet in Heaven, and book signing opportunities after his talk. You can pick up a copy of your favorite Mitch Albom book at the East Lansing Public Library. thank you so much for joining us today and for making my first podcast so seamless and easy, and for sharing your insights. I truly appreciate hearing it, and I look forward to your next book tremendously.
Thank you. Congratulations on the podcast, and I appreciate you having me as your guest.
You have been listening to The Director's Cut, an East Lansing Public Library podcast.